Chapter 4. The Lost City of Mocha. If you've ever ordered a mocha at a coffee shop, you've said the name of a real city out loud without probably knowing it. It's not a flavor. It's not a marketing invention dreamed up by a chain of cafes. It's the name of an actual port, on the actual coast of Yemen. That port once controlled something close to the entire world's supply of coffee. Today it barely exists as more than a fishing town with a sand-choked harbor and a name people around the world say every single day without a second thought. This is the strange story of how a single city became so completely synonymous with coffee that its name outlived its industry, its harbor, and very nearly its own physical existence. A city that grew no coffee at all. Here's the detail that surprises almost everyone the first time they hear it. Mocha never grew a single coffee plant. Not one. The city sat on the eastern shore of the Red Sea. Its entire relationship to coffee was as a port of export. It was the single funnel through which the coffee grown in the mountainous interior of Yemen had to pass on its way to the rest of the world. For roughly 2 centuries, if you were anywhere on earth outside of Arabia or Ethiopia and you drank coffee, there was an overwhelming chance the beans had traveled a specific path. They'd been carried down from Yemen's highland farms by camel caravan. They were sold in Mocha's markets, loaded onto a ship in Mocha's harbor, and shipped out under Mocha's name. The actual coffee farms were scattered across steep, terraced mountain valleys further inland, difficult, often barely accessible terrain that native Arab farmers had spent generations learning to cultivate. But none of those farms had ports. Mocha did. So whether the beans had been grown a mile from the coast or 100 miles deep in the mountains, by the time they reached a merchant ship bound for London, Amsterdam, or Marseille, they were simply Mocha coffee. The name came from the place they left from, not the place they grew. It's one of history's earliest and most successful examples of a place name becoming a permanent brand, completely detached from where a product actually originates. It happened so thoroughly that even now, centuries after Mocha stopped exporting a single bean, coffee shops worldwide still use the word to describe a coffee and chocolate drink that has nothing whatsoever to do with the city itself. If the name sounds familiar from earlier in this book, that's no accident. Mocha is the very city at the center of the Omar legend from our first chapter. It's where the exiled healer was said to have been guided by a mysterious veiled spirit. It's the plague-stricken city whose king's daughter he cured and then, less wisely, tried to run off with. Whether or not any of that particular story is true, later generations chose Mocha as the sacred backdrop for coffee's own creation myth. Mocha's patron saint, Sheikh Abu el-Hassan Skidhili, remained bound up in coffee folklore for centuries afterward. A city doesn't get chosen as the setting for its own legend by accident. By the time these stories were being told and retold, Mocha's name and coffee's identity were already so thoroughly fused together that no other city would have made sense as the setting. The world's only supplier. For a very long stretch of coffee's early history, Arabia wasn't simply the leading coffee producer. It was, for all practical purposes, the only one. Coffee is generally believed to have originated across the Red Sea in the Ethiopian highlands. But it was in the Yemeni district of Arabia that it was first deliberately, systematically cultivated as an agricultural crop, likely beginning sometime in the 15th or 16th century. This gave Arabia an extraordinary position, total control over a product that the rest of the known world had rapidly grown to crave. The Arabians were well aware of exactly what they had, and they moved to protect it. A jealously guarded monopoly. For years, Arabia successfully prevented coffee cultivation from spreading beyond its own borders. Their method was as effective as it was simple. No coffee bean was permitted to leave the country in a condition that could still grow. Before export, the beans were either steeped in boiling water or parched over heat, deliberately destroying their capacity to germinate. A trader in London or Amsterdam could buy all the roasted, brewable coffee he wanted. But he could never buy a living seed capable of becoming a tree on his own soil. Arabia intended to sell the world its coffee forever, and never once let the world grow its own. It was an audacious strategy and for a remarkably long time an effective one. Entire nations wanted this crop badly enough to go to considerable lengths to get it. For generations Arabia simply said no. Buying the coffee itself involved its own theater. Merchants in Aden and the surrounding trading posts developed a striking bargaining custom that outside visitors found endlessly fascinating. Buyer and seller would reach beneath a cloth draped over their hands. They negotiated a price entirely through a private, silent language of finger taps and grips, hidden from view of everyone else in the market. Neither the final price nor the negotiation itself was ever spoken aloud. It was commerce conducted almost like a secret handshake, ensuring that no bystander, rival merchant, or competitor ever learned exactly what price had been agreed upon. Europe comes calling. By the early 1600s, European trading powers had caught wind of exactly how valuable this Arabian monopoly was. They wanted in. The Dutch moved first and moved fast. Dutch traders visited Aden as early as 1614 specifically to investigate the coffee trade. Just 2 years later, in 1616, a trader named Peter van den Broek carried the first coffee out of Mocha to Holland that it would take until 1640 for the first proper commercial shipment of Mocha coffee to go up for sale in Amsterdam. Remarkably, this happened 4 years before coffee had even been introduced to France. It came only a few years after a Greek student had privately begun serving coffee at breakfast in Oxford, one of the drink's earliest toeholds in England. Regular, ongoing shipments of coffee from Mocha to Amsterdam began in 1663, and from there the trade only intensified. The British and French watched Dutch merchants profit handsomely from the trade. They scrambled to establish their own commercial footholds in the region. Each nation was eager to secure a reliable pipeline of the one commodity that all of fashionable Europe had suddenly, almost overnight, decided it could not live without. For decades, this arrangement suited everyone reasonably well. Arabia sold enormous quantities of roasted, unplantable beans at premium prices. Europe bought every bag it could get its hands on, still unable to grow a single coffee tree of its own. It is worth pausing to appreciate just how expensive this arrangement made coffee for the average European consumer of the era. Every single bean crossed thousands of miles of sea and desert from a single source with no competition whatsoever. For much of the 17th century, coffee was a genuine luxury good, a drink for merchants, nobles, and the comfortably wealthy. It was served in small quantities and treated with a reverence that seems almost unimaginable now, given that coffee is sold by the barrel at every corner shop on the planet today. Entire nations were, in effect, paying a permanent premium to a single Arabian monopoly simply for the privilege of staying awake and alert. It's little wonder that so many of Europe's merchants and monarchs eventually decided that buying coffee forever at whatever price Arabia set was a far worse arrangement than finding some way to grow it themselves. The cracks begin to show. No monopoly this valuable stays airtight forever, and Arabia's coffee stranglehold was no exception. Thousands of pilgrims traveled to and from Mecca every single year for religious observance. It proved simply impossible for Arabian authorities to inspect and intercept every single traveler passing through their territory. Somewhere in that constant human traffic, the seal on Arabia's monopoly had its first serious leak. Indian tradition holds that around the year 1600, a Muslim pilgrim named Baba Budin managed to carry living coffee seeds out of Arabia and back home to the mountains of Mysore in southern India. He planted them near the simple hut where he lived. Generations later, descendants of those very plants could still be found growing in the region, shaded by the same ancient jungle trees under which Baba Budin had first planted them. It was the first known crack in a monopoly that Arabia had guarded for well over a century. And it was only the beginning. Within a few more decades, Dutch traders would manage a far more consequential breach of their own. It would eventually put coffee cultivation into Dutch colonial hands entirely and change the shape of the global coffee trade forever. We're going to spend the entirety of the next chapter on exactly how that happened. The smuggled seedlings, the audacious sea voyages, and the almost unbelievable lengths that multiple nations went to in order to steal what Arabia refused to sell. For now, it's enough to know this. The wall Arabia built around its coffee monopoly, brick by careful brick, had begun quietly crumbling almost from the moment it was completed. The slow death of a harbor. Even without the loss of its monopoly, Mocha's days as a great trading port were numbered. The cause, fittingly for a coastal city, was the sea itself. Mocha's harbor sat in a roadstead that was notoriously difficult to keep clear, constantly threatened by sandbars that built up along the approach. Keeping the harbor navigable required continuous effort. As the surrounding trade routes shifted and competition from newly established coffee-growing colonies elsewhere in the world intensified, the investment and attention needed to maintain Mocha's harbor infrastructure simply stopped being worth it. By the early 19th century, Mocha had been effectively abandoned as a coffee exporting port. The trade that had once flowed exclusively through its harbor rerouted to Aden and Hodeidah instead. There, camel caravans from the interior mountains now unloaded their cargo at open-air coffee exchanges. It was sold through native brokers to representatives of European importing houses who, by this point, rarely bothered to visit Arabia in person at all. Mocha the trading empire quietly became Mocha the fishing town. The camel caravans stopped coming. The ships stopped docking. The city that had once been the single most important coffee port on the face of the earth slipped almost entirely out of the global economy it had helped build. A name that outlived the city. Here is the truly remarkable part of this story: none of that decline mattered to the name itself. Mocha had become so deeply, permanently attached to Arabian coffee during its centuries of dominance that the word simply kept being used long after the actual port had stopped shipping a single bag. Coffee from the Yemen highlands is still referred to as Mocha coffee today. It's sold by that name regardless of which specific port or overland route it actually travels through on its way to market. And the word didn't stop there. It drifted sideways into an entirely different meaning altogether: the now universal pairing of coffee and chocolate that coffee shops the world over call a mocha. This name choice traces back, however loosely, to the old observation that fine Arabian coffee sometimes carried a naturally chocolatey undertone in its flavor. A city most people alive today couldn't locate on a map has nonetheless left its name stamped permanently onto one of the most popular drinks on earth. Millions of people order it daily with absolutely no idea that Mocha was ever a real place, let alone the single most important coffee port that has ever existed. Few cities in history have achieved such total, lasting brand recognition while simultaneously becoming almost totally forgotten as an actual place. Rome is still Rome. Paris is still Paris. But Mocha, the city, has all but vanished from public consciousness. Meanwhile, Mocha, the word, is more famous today than it has ever been. What comes next? We left one thread dangling in this chapter, and it's too good a story to leave for later. The actual mechanics of how Arabia's iron grip on coffee cultivation was finally, decisively broken. Baba Buden's pilgrimage was the first crack, but it was far from the most dramatic. Dutch merchants would go on to steal living coffee plants and smuggle them halfway across the world into colonial greenhouses. The French would engineer a plant smuggling operation so audacious it reads more like an adventure novel than agricultural history. It came complete with pirate attacks, sabotage attempts, and a desperate sea captain rationing his own drinking water to keep a single coffee seedling alive. In the next chapter, we're diving into exactly how the world stole coffee from Arabia. Piece by piece, seedling by seedling, until the monopoly that once controlled the entire planet's coffee supply had nothing left to control at all.